Okay. All right, so let's start with some background about the book of Job itself, and then we'll get into the text and where the book is coming from and why it's so interesting in the Hebrew canon. The first thing is Job kind of resembles Jeremiah in a sense, in that it's hard to say that Job is a finalized book, right? As if somebody were writing, the book of Job. Somebody sat down and wrote it out. What we have with Job is much more of a traditional story, a story that has been told many times by many different people and kind of collected, right? Kind of like we talked about Jeremiah being like a Wikipedia page. The story of Job kind of looks like that too, right? With the manuscripts of Job that we have, a lot of them are really different, right? For example, we have the Masoretic text of Job, right, which is the Hebrew version. The Septuagint, the Greek version of Job, is incredibly different, right? Not as if somebody sat down and did revisions on that, but to the point of saying the Greek version is probably based on some other Hebrew manuscript, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls are very different than this, okay? So we have Job is kind of this conglomeration of texts and dialogues and ideas. And it's good to kind of have that, it's good to recognize that when we approach the book. Also, as far as translation goes, Job is very difficult to translate. There's over 100 words in Job that only appear in Job itself, right? So it presents a lot of difficulties as far as translating goes. Another thing that we've seen time and time again as we've looked at Hebrew text is that Job is not unique as a story. There are many other Near Eastern parallels, and I apologize for this. Can we turn off one of the lights, maybe? I didn't realize the red would be this much harder. There we go, that's good. There's many other parallels in the ancient Near East, right? And obviously these are not titles given to these books, that these books had originally, but they were given by scholars just to say this is a work, right? There's a Sumerian text, a couple Babylonians, a couple Egyptian, right? And now this is all to say that it's not that Job has borrowed from these texts or that there's overlap in that kind of way, but just to recognize that Job is part of a tradition, right? That there are other works that are very similar to Job that kind of fall into a genre, right? It's as if we, had Sleeping Beauty and, what's another fairy tale?
Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast, right? Right. If somebody Frozen.
Please don't.
Please don't. Yeah. If somebody found both these texts, we could say, oh, there's lots of overlaps here,
Yeah.
right? But they're not the same work, right? So that's kind of how these are. Okay. And what connects them all is that they are stories that often use dialogue to tell a story that questions traditional views of divine justice, as it tries to make sense of the suffering of an innocent person. And this is a very important part. Trying to make sense of the suffering of an innocent person. And this genre is referred to as Theodicy. Right? And Theodicy just means divine justice. So these books ask the basic question, why do good people suffer? So what we have in this genre is the questioning of proverbial and deuteronomistic assumptions that the good get rewarded and the wicked get punished. Because it sees suffering of good people, right? Why do good things happen to bad people? Right? So it's questioning kind of those assumptions within Deuteronomistic history and within proverb and wisdom literature that the good get what they deserve and the wicked get what they deserve. Right? Specifically in this lifetime. And we'll see how that plays onto this. So what we're going to have with Job are three big questions. Or I guess two big questions and then kind of another leading one. And the first is what's being questioned. What is Job wrestling with? What is the book of Job wrestling with? The next one is why. Right? why is this book written now? Right? Why does somebody feel like they have to wrestle with these questions? And finally, are there any new conclusions that the book comes to? These are going to be the questions that we're going to look at as we turn to this book and try to place it in the Hebrew tradition. Yeah.
Is there a theory that, because I've heard there's a theory that Job is the oldest, like, written down book in the Hebrew Bible?
I don't think I've heard that, and I think what we're going to see is that it's probably one of the latest.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, okay, I guess then the other side of that is that it's not the oldest written book, but it's like one of the oldest stories that's in the Bible.
It's been passed down.
I think along with that, we're going to kind of see how it's potentially coming much later.
Okay.
Oh. I read that it was later.
So, but as with many things in the Hebrew Bible, a lot of these are passed down orally. So, I mean, there's obviously debate, but as far as when we look at why the book is written, that's going to maybe help us place it historically, and especially in what it's responding to. So, if it's responding to something that it's responding to probably needs to come earlier, right?
Right.
So, let's start with that. What is being questioned? As we said, the book deals with the question of theodicy, of divine justice. Now, for the Deuteronomistic history, there's no problem here, right? We kind of went through that, the Proverbs. We looked all through that wisdom tradition, right? The good get what they deserve, right? The good get rewarded with riches, with life, right? With well-being. The wicked get their comeuppance, right? There's no problem with the Deuteronomistic history. You get what you deserve in this life, right? So we can think of things like, when we think of Deuteronomistic wisdom, think of Proverbs, the wisdom tradition, right? Coming out of the Deuteronomistic history, right? We saw with the Deuteronomistic history the idea that, sometimes that punishment is delayed sometimes it's not, right? With Ezekiel saying, no, you're going to get what you deserve, right? But there's still this idea that justice, whether that's punishment or reward, is dealt out within this timeline.
I'm
right?
sorry. What was the WT again?
A wisdom tradition.
Oh.
Right, so within this timeline, you get what you deserve, whether it's your children or you yourself. Right? And the reason we need to recognize that there is a problem here for Job and for the question of why do good people suffer is because in the Hebrew mindset, there is no afterlife. We get, within the Hebrew Bible, the idioms that we get to refer to what happens when people die. We get things like, went to sleep with his fathers, right? Was gathered to their kin, right? And we get this concept, the concept of Shale, right? That I'm sure some of you have seen pop up in the works that we've been looking at so far this semester. And Shale is pretty much this dark, dirty, damp place where everybody goes. No matter if you've been good or bad, it's just where everyone goes. Right? It gets referred to as the pit sometimes. If you read through Jonah, it talks about the bars of Shale, right? To keep the people in. In Job, we get this, right? The land of gloom and deep darkness, the land of gloom and chaos, where light is like the darkness. Right? Just total darkness. Right? This idea of chaos, right? This is beyond God's created order. Right? And this is just where everybody goes. And you get kind of there's a tension a little bit in the tradition because you'll get some psalms and writings that will say, who can praise God from Shale? Right? Pretty much saying like, look, if you're in Shale, you're just there, you're done. But then you get other kind of inklings of God saving people from Shale. Or maybe from the brink of Shale.
Shale sound like hell.
Yeah. Hell is more connected with the Greek idea of Hades.
But that is more saying for the ground, like when you die,
God going uneven ground.
Well, there's a sense in which if Shale is a place of dust, think about the phrase, from dust you came, to dust you shall return. Right? There's this idea that, look, you were made from dust, you are going to return to dust. This is not some afterlife where you are living with God, you are just returning to what you were made from.
So in their concept of Shale, are they like alive, walking around, or is it just?
It's hard to say,
Okay.
because for the Hebrew mindset, because of this idea of you getting what you deserve in this life, there's not a lot of emphasis on the afterlife.
Okay.
Right? The modern ideas have this, or we as moderns have this idea of a soul.
Right.
Sometimes in Hebrew the word is nephesh, and it's really it is not one thing. It's good to say. It's easier to say what nephesh is not than what it is. Nephesh is not this like ghost living inside of a physical shell. Okay. It's not that, oh, your shell dies and then that living thing inside you goes and lives down in Shale, right? Nephesh is just kind of like your essence, like your you, right? It's what makes you you. It's like, you kind of have a different essence from everybody, right? But everybody kind of has a nephesh. It's kind of hard to like pinpoint and say, this is it. Just because they're not working with this idea of a soul. Like this comes much later in thinking. But it is the nephesh that kind of descends to Shale.
Okay.
Right, like I said, all are equal here, right? Good or bad, go to Shale. As we saw with Samuel and Saul, right? Samuel has died. Saul wants to talk to Samuel, and so he goes to a necromancer to get Samuel's spirit back, and this happens, right? And so you have this potential for souls to kind of come back, even though from the Hebrew mindset like this, you should not do this, right? It's a possibility, you just don't do it, right? So there's this interesting kind of idea of what happens after you die. But what's important to kind of get into our heads is that this is not something people come back from, right? This is not some place where justice is dealt. Right? It's not like, oh, you get to go to a nice part of Shale.
Right.
Right. You get to go to the gated community of Shale. Right? That's not there. Right? It's really only in the 5th century BCE that we get starting to get Greek ideas of like the upper regions. Right? And kind of get this idea of that. And we'll see how that kind of comes into play with Daniel. But And this is where, the ideas of bodily resurrection come in, is again a little bit later. We don't get that until like the 2nd century BCE. So here's why there's a problem. Because your punishment or reward needs to happen in this life. If there is no concept of justice being dealt after life. Right? If you live a good life, right, you can't say, oh, God will just, give me a bigger house when I die, because that's not within their mindset. And that's why there's such a problem. So let's look at how, does that kind of clarify the problem that Job is dealing with here?
Yes.
So let's kind of set the stage. Oh, do I want to talk about that right now? No, I'm going to delay that one. Sorry. All right, so let's set the stage. And this is here's why we see there's such a problem here. This is how Job starts out. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Right? This is what we call a narrative fact. The story is setting this up for you. This is not debatable. This is not like, well, maybe Job was prideful, or maybe Job was, had some secret sin that, in the depths of his soul, right? This is a narrative fact. The story is setting it up this way for a purpose. And what did we say was the fear of God is what? The beginning of? Wisdom. So we have here Job, who is blameless and who is a wise person, right? Is within the wisdom tradition. And if that's not enough for you, if it's not enough for the narrator to say that Job is blameless and fully within the wisdom tradition, then God says it. The Lord said to the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God." Right? This is a narrative fact for the story, and it's important to hold on to this for Job to have any kind of meaning. And I point out this fact of wisdom because within the wisdom tradition, right, one who is blameless and upright should have lots of good things, right? And the story tells us he does, right? He has 7 sons, 7 daughters, lots of stuff, lots of land, lots of property, lots of sheep and cattle, right? So in a sense, like the story is setting us up how we would expect it. If one is blameless and upright and fears God, then wisdom tradition tells us that this person should be reaping those rewards, right? And it sets it up that way, right? He has all these things. And then we have, entering onto the stage, the Satan. And the Hebrew is ha-Satan. Satan is a Hebrew word. But it's important to know what that word means in Hebrew, right? This is a very kind of modern depiction, in a sense, of the Satan, because what we have from a Western standpoint is not the Satan, but Satan is a proper name, right? As being the devil, right? The evil one, right? Beelzebub, right? I'm not going to even attempt to spell that, right? In Hebrew, Satan literally means, it can mean accuser, it can mean one who opposes. Right? This is not a name, right? We get this one who we could say stands against. For example, in 1 Samuel, David gets referred to as a Satan, right? The Philistines don't want David to go with them into battle because they're worried that David's going to oppose them. Like, once they start fighting, that David's going to come back and start fighting them, right? That David will stand in their way, right? There's also kind of a legal way of thinking about this. The best way to probably think about the Satan in this story is, one, he's definitely part of the divine council. He has not emerged from the bowels of Shale to come talk to God. He's just up there. Right? So he's a member of the divine council. And he kind of takes the role of a prosecuting attorney. Yeah. we'll just call the Satan as the DA. I like that. This is his role, right? He is not referred to as evil. He is not referred... the idea of the devil comes from, in Greek, this gets translated to diablos, right? Which is where we get the term like diabolical, kind of comes from the same root. And this is where we get the term devil, is from the Greek, not the Hebrew, right? This is why I translated this part, the accuser. The Lord said to the accuser. The Lord said to the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Right? So here we have Satan, or the Satan, coming to God and saying, after we've set the stage, right, of Job being a blameless individual who fears God and has all this stuff as he should be accorded. And the DA, the heavenly DA, comes to God and says, "Are you sure that Job actually loves you, actually fears you? And it's not just because he gets all this good stuff that he does this," right? It's like, pretty much saying, are you sure Job isn't just like a good dog, right? That you give him treats and so he begs. You give him treats and so he heals. You give him treats and so he rolls over, right? This is Satan's question to God. In a sense, Satan is bringing into question, the whole wisdom tradition, right? This connection between, we'll just call it, doing good and rewards. This whole system of Theodicy is what this heavenly DA is kind of bringing into question. And it's important to know that Satan is merely here as kind of an agent of God, right? He comes and he says, God, is this the case? And God says, I don't know. Go and test him, right? So he has to give the Satan permission to go and do these things, right? And even after giving him permission to do these things, it's only at the end of the story, it's only God who really shows up, right? The Satan has served his role, he's done his task, and he's out of the picture, right? So in this story, it's not that the Satan is the explanation for evil or what goes wrong in the world, right? It's ultimately God that's in control, and we'll see that definitely at the end, that Satan here has no power beyond what God has granted him to do in this story, right? Which is why it's important to remember that he's just a member of this kind of divine council in this story. So we have these questions, right, that the Satan poses, right? How can such pain be inflicted on one who is upright and wise? How can this be justified? Does Job's suffering mean that God is not good or in control? And so on, right? These are all questions that the story is going to try to answer. So, this is the problem. Now let's move into how the story deals with that. Now Job's friends come to him. They sit with him for a while. And Job is moaning and groaning because he's lost his entire family and lost everything that's important to him. Right? Has been afflicted with bodily wounds. Right? Everything is gone. Somebody can't even come to Job and say, hey, at least you have your health, because he doesn't even have that, right? Everything is gone. And this is what Job's friends come to him and say. For example, think now, who was it that innocent, it's an interesting translation, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Right? This sounds like what?
The wisdom.
Yeah, this sounds like the wisdom tradition. This sounds like Proverbs. Do you not know this from of old, right? From of old, we're dealing with the tradition here. Ever since mortals were placed on earth, that the exalting of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless is but for a moment. Right? Same thing. Job's friends represent the wisdom tradition. They are the voice of this whole Deuteronomic proverbial wisdom tradition. Right? That's what they're giving voice to in this story. They're pretty much saying, Job, you have to repent because obviously you have done something wrong. That is the only way they know to explain Job's sufferings, is that he has done something wrong, and so what he needs to do is repent. Now, Job's response, on the other hand, kind of cuts this down. He says this, why do the wicked live on, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their children are established in their presence, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and no rod of God is upon them. Right? Job 13. As for you, you whitewashed with lies. All of you are worthless physicians. If you would only keep silent, that would be your wisdom. Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. Right? Job is very much rejecting the wisdom tradition. He's saying, what I see doesn't match up with what you're claiming. I see people who are wicked, who are growing mighty, and their children are fine. Right? Where's this supposed rod of God who is going to punish them? Right? They seem to be doing just fine. Right? It says, keep silent, that would be your wisdom. He goes so far as to call God to court. I remember the Riv. This is court summons. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. I have indeed prepared my case. I know that I shall be vindicated. Right? So notice what's going on here. for both Job and his friends, both are kind of assuming that there is some kind of divine justice in this life. Right? They're both kind of working from this traditional view of theodicy. However, Job's friends are saying, look, you must have sinned. Job's saying, no, I haven't. Therefore, I'm innocent. Therefore, this suffering is wrong. Right? Both are kind of using the same standard. Job's friends are saying, no, you're guilty, so just repent. Job's saying, no, I'm not. Therefore, I'm innocent. Right? And what God's doing is wrong. And God is the guilty one. Right? They're both kind of working within this traditional view. They're both engaging that traditional view of theodicy. Right? Now, the question is, or one question that we are met with then, and we have to kind of confront as we read this book, is why is this question being brought up, right? Why is there this tradition of these stories that are like this? And one possible explanation is that Job is written at a time when we have this kind of disappointment, right? It's very easy in times of peace to say, oh, of course there's divine justice, right? If everything is going well for you, it's easy to see that God is on your side, right? And so we could say potentially, we looked all the way through those prophets, right? And all the way through the prophets are trying to say, here's how God is not abandoning you. Here's how God is still in control. But once the Jewish people have returned to their homeland and things don't go well, and there is kind of this, okay, we've come out of exile and our home, but things still aren't great. After prolonged periods of suffering, it's much harder to say, oh, there's this sense of divine justice that's at work in the world, right? Because you feel like, no, we have continually done what is good. Think of the psalm. I think one of the psalms that you all have potentially says, it says that you potentially have it. It says, we haven't done anything wrong. Why have you forgotten us? Right? So this kind of tradition that Job is giving voice to, potentially coming late, and this is what I was saying, Jackson, about this why question, as far as coming out of a time of disappointment and struggle. Right. This question of where is the cosmic balance? We've returned to Jerusalem. We've tried to set up the temple. We've tried to reenact or continue again our cultic life, and yet there is no kind of fixing of the scales. And so what we could possibly see is Job is not just a character who, suffers unheard of cosmic injustice. He's not just a philosophical tool, but he, in a sense, represents the community. Right? And maybe you want to write this down. Job represents the communal confusion of the Jewish people.
Job what?
Represents the communal confusion of the Jewish people. Right? Having to come to terms with the reality that doesn't correspond to their theology. Right, coming to terms, trying to figure out how to make their present reality and their theology, their understanding of God and divine justice, how to make these two work together.
It's kind of like a cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, for sure. The cognitive dissonance is a really good way to refer to the book of Job. Coming to terms with the reality that doesn't seem to correspond with their theology. Right, there's this Job representing this communal confusion of the Jewish people who, right, in this post-exilic Persian era, right, are having to come to terms with this reality that doesn't correspond to how they think divine justice works out. Right, so Job kind of embodies Israel's suffering and cries out to God to make sense of it. Right? So we can almost kind of see like Job as almost a psalm, right? The community crying out to God through this story, right? Trying to make sense of their situation.
A lament song?
In a sense, yeah. Yeah, I think we do have a lament here. I mean, I see what happens to Job is there's a lot of lament in this. In a sense, too, like it's kind of interesting because Job kind of mimics the Psalms in the sense that, remember we talked about the Psalms as being the people speaking to God, right? And I think that there's a very strong human voice in the book of Job. Right? So like you said, we have the friends who are representing this traditional view, Job kind of critiquing that. And then finally, at the end of the book, right after like these huge monologues, that he's got 3 friends and one more finally shows up, and Job's still there saying the same thing the whole time, pretty much telling them to shut up and they don't know what they're talking about. God finally shows up on the scene, right? And God has a response, but God's response is really bizarre because he doesn't answer any of Job's questions, and he doesn't answer any of ours, in a sense, right? The readers. Pretty much what God says is, he starts just talking about creation.
Yeah, I created all this
Right?
for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he goes through this like huge long monologue himself, right, just like the friends in Job, about creation, which seems really like God's kind of missing the point. It's like, have you been listening? Because there's this whole conversation that you're not. It seems like you're kind of sidestepping. And what I think is important to see here, and what may be going on, is that God is refusing to be seen, or the author is presenting God as refusing to be seen as a moral accountant. Right? God not being a moral accountant. In a sense saying, you have much too narrow a view of what is going on with the grand scope of things to think that God is just sitting up there, right, being this kind of moral accountant and rewarding people and punishing others. Right? That there's this much bigger thing called creation that you are just one little blip of, right? And he goes through and talks about, for example, the behemoth and the leviathan, right? And traditionally these get seen as like a hippo and a crocodile or something, or a giraffe sometimes.
No, I thought it was a dragon.
A dragon? Yeah. So these kinds of things. The behemoth and the leviathan, probably the best way to understand these are the mythical creatures of creation, right? These like mythical creatures, that pretty much what the text says is that God has made them as pets. Right? These like things, I mean, think Tiamat in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or sorry, not the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Enuma Elish, right? This mythical dragon, right? God is saying here in this response, look, that's my pet, right? I feed it kibble. This is what's going on. Also, the book, God's response in the book of Job, takes a shot at this whole idea of an orderly creation. It says it's not that orderly. Right? For one thing, we've got Behemoth and Leviathan are still roaming about. But we also have things like baby birds go hungry. Ostriches, that's really hard to say. Ostrichi. Abandoning their eggs. Right? These things shouldn't happen in an orderly creation, but they do. Right? So there's a shot at this whole priestly notion of a creation that is very orderly.
I think ostrich is like moose. He's
Just an ostrich?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Ostrich leaving their eggs.
Ostrich. You were sitting there like thinking about that one.
Yeah, I was like, how do you say that?
I appreciate that.
No problem.
Right? So there's all these kind of critiques within God's response that in a sense do provide a response to Job's questions. Right? That no, like you cannot reduce God to being this moral accountant. Right? And that's why this whole Theodicy thing says, the text essentially says, this is beyond you.
Right.
Right? And so we have this idea, as opposed to wisdom literature that says, look, just learn wisdom and live a good life. Job says that wisdom is hidden. Right? This is from Job 28. Where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Mortals do not know the way to it. and is not found in the land of the living. Where then does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? It's hidden from the eyes of all living. Right? And it's not even up in the clouds, right? It's concealed from the birds of the air. Right? So this idea that wisdom is hidden. Right? So what we have, in a sense, is not figure out what it means to live a good life. What we have, in a sense, is this picture, based on God's response here, that God is all-powerful. And what is demanded of humans is simply Torah obedience. Right? We are not working with this idea that God is just and that what's needed is wisdom. Right? These are two separate perspectives, right? The idea that God is just and so one needs to figure out wisdom is the perspective of Proverbs. Right? The idea that God is all-powerful and that what's needed is just simply obedience is what we find kind of in Job, because wisdom is essentially hidden. Right? So this is kind of what we see, or this is what we see in the book of Job, and I think that's, yeah. This is what we see in the book of Job and why it's such an interesting book, because it confronts these kind of traditional values and says, I don't see things that way. And so these new conclusions, they're new conclusions in a sense, but it's also kind of just the voicing. I think probably what Job does, like I said, is less I'm going to present an argument and more the voicing of this kind of communal frustration, this communal disappointment, this communal lament, as Thelma said, and tries to offer some ways of understanding and contextualizing that lament. Right? And says, we can't figure this out. So the best we can do is Torah obedience. The best we can do is be a people centered around the Torah. Right? Because it doesn't seem like this whole traditional view of wisdom that we've laid out throughout most of our history really holds the way we want it to. Right? And this is also why we'll see in Daniel, when we get there on Friday, this idea of those cosmic scales, those cosmic justice scales, being pushed to after the timeline. Right? Job and Ecclesiastes say, look, you're not going to be able to figure out this cosmic scale. Daniel's going to kind of reaffirm that there is a cosmic scale, but it's just afterlife. Right?
So when we talk about the apocalyptic writings and stuff at the end of the time scale, what we were talking about, us as moderns, we have our ideas, and one of our ideas is the idea of rapture or whatever, us going to be with God, whatever. And what did the Hebrew people think is going to happen at the apocalypse? Is it all gone or what?
Well, like I said, apocalyptic literature is a kind of literature that comes out much later, right? For most of the history of the Hebrew writings, there's just not a big emphasis on it. On this, what happens after you die.
Because they focus more on the show.
Yeah, because there's just...
We've even looked at apocalyptic literature, in Ezekiel and stuff.
Right, well, we haven't gotten to Daniel. The prophets who have brought up apocalyptic literature are later prophets, right? These are prophets of the Persian period.
Okay.
And this is where Daniel's going to be speaking from. It's from this later period. Yeah. And this apocalyptic literature says, look, there is going to be this grand cosmic balance at the end. That the righteous will be justified, that the wicked will be punished. But it's just going to happen at the end of the timeline, after the timeline. Yeah. But for the most part, and this is why I said it's so important to kind of put Job in its cultural context, is because there has to be justice within this life, because there's not much of an afterlife. You just go live in Shale, right? Gathered to Abraham's bosom, gathered to your kin, right? You just kind of have these really ubiquitous, or not ubiquitous, but ambiguous ways of referring to what happens after you die.
But in other books, there's more of an idea of an afterlife. Is what you're saying?
The books that are written during the Persian period.
Right.
Not the exile, but the return. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Okay, are there any other questions?